we're looking from on the top of page 10. The reason we're starting there is because that's where I got up to with my discussions last night. I say discussions, they're not discussions. I'm on my own in my kitchen. I'm on my own in my kitchen telling my girlfriend not to come into the kitchen. Go away. So, we're starting with this Stella saying, you seem a little bit nervous or overwrought or something. I think the key features of those lines are the ones that's highlighted these use of conjunctions, the or, the or, the or. She is identifying that there's something wrong with Blanche, but what it reveals is, most importantly, is her unfamiliarity with Blanche herself, but also this type of sort of anxious hysteria. It shows us partly that Stella is relatively composed. And I think that's important because the contrast between the two is really about the way that one of them is able to adapt to the changing circumstances in America and the other one can't, and by the other one I mean Blanche. Blanche is unable to adapt to the new reality, really, of the 20th century. She is attached to, the old South, and that is a huge part of the conflict that's embodied between the actions between her and Stanley. And you can see this because she immediately says, will Stanley like me? Or will I just be a visiting in-law, Stella? I couldn't stand that. And you can hear in the backdrop of this question, that conflict between sort of rampant 20th century materialism and industrialization and her attachment to the old kind of outmoded values of the South. There's an awful lot of chivalry and a conception of the family in the backdrop of that particular question. So when she says, will Stanley like me? There is an example here of what we would call proleptic irony. And that's the fancy name for foreshadowing. That's all it means. Foreshadowing. Proleptic just means looking forward. So that's what's written here. Proleptic irony. Ominous. This is an ominous warning about the fact that they're not going to get along very well together. And Stella says, you will get along fine together if you'll just try not to, compare him with men that we went out with at home. Is he so different? Yes, a different species. So he's not only a different type of man altogether. This language that Stella uses is at least part of the problem. Stanley, is very deliberately characterized as this kind of vital sort of alpha male. He's a kind of rutting stag of the cast. And the language that Stella uses to make sense of him, I think, gives it this sort of Darwinian flavour. That he's not only a different human, he's a different species. And is therefore, to someone like Blanche, unrelatable. She can't connect with him because it's not just a different type of guy, he's a different proposition altogether. And that I think, feeds into this dramatic conflict between Blanche and her values and Stanley and what he stands for, the kind of the new America that absorbs migrants, that industrializes, that makes its way towards the 20th century. This play is written at the moment that America became the global hegemon, the world superpower. And Stanley sort of represents the lifeblood of that economic reality. Migrants that were willing to fight for America, come back, work hard, and industrialize and try and chase the American dream. Stella is the old South that's decaying and its values dying out. And one of the key things to understanding the play is to understand the moral ambiguity of this. I think, Tennessee Williams most definitely identifies more personally with Blanche than he does with any of the other characters. But I don't think that it's a straightforward kind of, look at this individual who's suffering from the plight of the artist who can't adapt to reality. He doesn't, for example, show a great deal of attachment to sort of, racism and the social hierarchy that Blanche depends upon. There is sympathy for her, basically, her inability to adapt to a world where there are no absolute moral values. And that's what she's attracted to. And that's what you can see in this question here. Will I just be a visiting in-law, Stella? I couldn't stand that. She wants this tight-knit family that is part of that set of social norms of the Old South. That's what she's looking for here. And Stella, we see this awareness that she's not gonna be able to relate to him on those terms. You'll get along fine together if you don't compare him with people that we went out with at home. You've got to adapt to changing reality.
When Blanche says, is he so, Paul's different? Could that like show her tone of voice, how she's opposed to change and
Yeah.
diversity?
Absolutely. Blanche is the character where you'll see there's dashes a lot more in her dialogue. And what it reveals is that she's obviously, there is subtext all the time to what she says. But
She's disgusting.
yeah, and this is where there's an interesting point of contrast with Pinter, because all of the meaning in Pinter is subtext. As I'm sure you've noticed from looking at it, you probably look at it and think, well, what the hell do I analyse in this? There's just these two weirdos having this menial conversation about nothing, cornflakes or whatever. All of it is subtext. Everything is what is not being said, which is why it's actually quite hard to analyse. But once you get the hang of it, you get into the flow with Pinter. Always, language in Pinter is something that you use to shroud what you really mean, rather than to actually communicate it. And Blanche is like this kind of awkward middle point between, someone like Tennessee Williams, who cannot resist giving you the strongest possible clues to the figurative meaning of his text. If you look at his stage directions and his setting, his mise en scène, all of those things are almost sort of screaming out the figurative significance of the symbolic properties of those things. And Pinter is literally the polar opposite. He'll not tell you absolutely anything about the significance of the stage direction, the stage business, the setting, the mise en scène. None of that stuff is directly communicated. And Blanche is this kind of halfway house where she tries really desperately to leave subtext unspoken, but can't help herself. And you see that a number of times through the play. I meant to say that it was actually convenient. Oh, but actually I was a real bitch and told you what I honestly thought of it. She can't quite resist not saying what she really thinks. And you'll see that frequently throughout the text is the dashes that occur in her dialogue are significantly more frequent than any of the other characters. The different species comment is an important one, because one of the consistent motifs in this play is animal imagery again. It crops up in the same way that it does in Othello. And it's very often used to define Stanley. That opening scene where he's a whisker away from being a big chest-beating gorilla. Meat. He comes back with his meat, throws it at Stella and just says, meat, and he's got like one-word lines. He's a whisker away from being a big kind of chimpanzee. And that is partly what is reflected in the language of the play. There's constant utilization of this animalistic imagery that's a motif all the way through the play to represent the kind of primitivism of this new set of values that Blanche is struggling to adapt to. She cannot get her head around this cold, rampant kind of commercial materialism that someone like Stanley represents. And Williams associates it with this kind of rutting alpha male sexual vitality that everyone is compelled by in the play. And we see that the compelling nature of Stanley's sexuality becomes a lot more evident in the second half of this. Stella says, oh, you can't describe someone you're in love with. And you give it, very clearly that communicates to us the sort of uncontrollable nature of her desire for him. She can't help but find him sexually compelling. And, if you watch the film with Marlon Brando in it, you'll probably sympathise with her. Even I find myself struggling sometimes, And she just hands her a photograph. So she's not even going to bother to attempt to recapitulate in language the nature of her feelings. She just gives him a photograph. She just gives Blanche a photograph here. Here you go. I'm not even going to try and explain why. Just take a look at it. And Blanche's immediate presumption is a class-based one. Is he an officer? She doesn't reflect on how sort of his physical attractiveness. She immediately says, is he an officer? So there's a sense of class-based presumption that figures in her estimation of Stella's thinking. Well, of course, if you're that attracted to him, he must be an officer. He must be from at least the upper middle class. He can't be an ordinary soldier. But one of the key things to this dialogue that we see here, and this is something that you won't be able to deal with too well at this stage, is that what we find out later on is that one of the ways that Blanche has been trying to escape the trauma of her husband killing herself is by sleeping with lots of different soldiers, because she lives near an army base. So this dialogue here has a really kind of salacious subtext that Stella doesn't fully appreciate yet, because she thinks that type of behaviour would be beyond Blanche. So Stella says, no, he's a master sergeant in the engineer corps. That's a high rank in the military that you can have basically before you have a university education, usually. It's the highest you can go, basically, without being effectively middle class. those are decorations. So we're saying, he's a decorated war hero. And Blanche says, he had those on when you met him, question mark. But obviously what Blanche is excited by here is the possibility of establishing a sense of intimacy with her sister, because she knows that she's also being compelled by these military men. She's found them attractive. And what Blanche is anticipating is that they're going to be able to strike up some kind of intimacy, some sort of relationship again, based on their sort of mutual attraction for soldiers. And Stella says, I assure you, I wasn't just blinded by all the brass. So Stella sort of misreads Blanche's intentions here. Stella thinks that Blanche is about to get on her high horse and criticize her for, being blinded by their military decorations. And you see that through Blanche's line. That's not what the subtext is left unspoken, because it's building up the sense of dramatic climax that the play reveals later on, that she has been sleeping around with lots of soldiers. What she's anticipating at this moment in time is being able to talk to her sister about it. So this is one of those moments where we do actually feel a little bit of sympathy for Blanche, I think, because she's incredibly isolated. And I think this is one of those tiny moments of suggestion where she may be able to reach out from her isolation and to connect with someone, her family member, albeit based on, kind of being promiscuous. But there's a moment there of possibility of genuine, authentic emotional connection, and it's shut down, ironically, because of the way that Stella is anticipating Blanche's hostility. So because Stella thinks Blanche is going to criticize her for being attracted to a military man, she actually misreads the cues. She's expecting Blanche to kind of be critical of her for being attracted to a military man. And she says, but of course, there were things to adjust myself to later on. And this is where we really see Blanche's feelings most clearly in this line here, such as his civilian background. You had to actually get used to the fact that he wasn't a handsome man in uniform, And that's where we see her feelings most clearly. And that's where we see that this is a moment of that's not almost cashed in on. This is a moment of possible intimacy that never really materializes because of the distance between them. And that's another key feature to these opening scenes, is the isolation of the protagonists. Stanley in Birthday Party and Blanche in Streetcar are incredibly isolated, both from the characters with whom they're supposed to have relationships and from the surroundings that they find themselves in. And partly what we see here, though, is Blanche's fear. As soon as Stella says, Stanley doesn't know yet about Blanche arriving, Blanche is immediately frightened. And it's important here because it seems to suggest that Blanche is aware that Stanley represents a reality that she should be fearful about. There's a sense of her understanding here. She knows, if she's frightened straight away, she knows that Stanley represents something that is going to cause conflict for her, that's going to cause internal conflict. He represents a reality that, by its existence, threatens the existence of what she is happy to call reality. And you can see that through her stage directions here. And she said, you haven't told him. He's on the road a good deal. Oh, travels? Yes. And then Blanche says, good, isn't it? You can see again in that final line, good, isn't it? That the fear, her fear of him is the subtext there that's being unspoken. She's happy that he might not be there.
Could that also lead to a theme of willful self-destruction? She is consciously choosing people that just destroy her.
Absolutely. One of the key things in all of these plays is the way that characters are compelled by forces beyond their control. And really in Streetcar, it's probably the most explicit. The streetcar named desire that drives Blanche's fate is one that she doesn't really have control over. She's compelled by her own passionate physicality, and that's what's in many ways has destroyed her family's well-being. It's destroyed her own well-being. And in this case, she is compelled towards Stanley. She's compelled towards something that is, by its existence, a kind of an existential threat to her. And that's where that moth imagery comes from in the opening stage directions. Is that she's like a moth to a flame, compelled towards things that will destroy her. And that's where that metaphor and figurative trope is utilized by Williams in the opening. Stella, we get more of Stella's, teenage girly love obsession for Stanley here. She's half to herself. I can hardly stand it when he is away for a night. And again, this brings up another point of comparison between this text and Pinter is the passive roles that women adopt in these texts. You know, she adopts a passive role here because of the intensity of her physical attraction to Stanley. You know, she has had to adapt to that, and she's half willfully adapted to it, but at least as much of her attraction to him is uncontrollable and fully sort of volitional and physical. She finds him unbelievably physically attractive, and we see this here. She says, when he's away for a week, I nearly go wild. And it's that vocabulary of animalistic behavior. You know, he's a different species. He causes her to go wild. We're talking about a type of behavior that from Blanche's perspective looks uncivilized, you know, from the chivalrous values of the Old South, which I always find so laughably hypocritical, that chivalry is important, but, you know, torturing people based on their race is not, you know. There's a problematic basis of that. But this vocabulary to Blanche is threatening. It's animalistic, and it represents an existential threat to the sort of chivalry and the nobility of the Old South. And Blanche says, gracious, you know, that's a very deliberate vocabulary choice. It's a very old-fashioned, kind of prim and proper lady's word. Goodness gracious, you know, she's talking about basically finding him unbelievably physically, sexually attractive, and her response is gracious. You know, she sounds like my grandma. She's supposed to sound a little bit, you know, at odds with this reality. She sounds like my granny. And Stella, you know, captures this at the end. When he comes back, I cry on his lap like a baby, and she smiles to herself. So look at, you know, this leads her to adopt a submissive, passive role in the face of Stanley's domineering masculinity. She can adapt to this new reality, but only if she accepts a very compromised sense of female agency. You know, there's an Oedipal element to this, crying like a baby. You'll see tons of Oedipal imagery in all these plays. They're in all of them. Desire Under the Elms is like a 3-5 act Oedipal nightmare, and it's all of these plays are, you know, the moment of dramatic crisis in a birthday party involves Stanley kind of sort of sexually dominating another female figure, and his relationship with Meg is incredibly Oedipal in lots of aspects. So that is something to be alive to in all of these plays. You know, it comes from Greek tragedy, so it has a particular currency in drama.
If you don't see like someone for a long time, when you cry on his shoulder.
I know where you're going with this question. I know where this question is leading us. You're leading us to the anatomical distinctions between someone's lap and their shoulder, and the connotations of that particular gravitation.
In the movies, when they withdraw, like you cry on their shoulder.
This is a more submissive position, and we'll leave it at that. I'll let you fill in the gaps in your own imagination. I know what you're trying to get me to talk about, Luca. I'm experienced in this.
What did that say before? Adopts
a submissive or passive role in the face of Stanley's domineering masculinity. Blanche, there's an important transition that goes on at the top of this page here, where what we're seeing is Blanche's internal conflict, but we're not seeing it. This is actually a moment of quite profound subtext, because Blanche's first reflection is, I guess that is what is meant by being in love. She obviously sees in her sister that she is in some way in love, but it's a vision of love that she's not familiar with. It's a vision of love based on carnal kind of sexuality that has produced actual genuine intimacy. Obviously, Blanche is, as we find out later on, experienced with carnal sexuality, but it hasn't produced intimacy. She hasn't got any successful relationships out of that approach to life. So, yeah, there's a sense of bewilderment here that comes from the fact that she is alarmed that this has produced some kind of genuine emotional consequences. Stella looks at her with a radiant smile, and immediately Blanche says, Stella, and this is where there's a shift. What's been brought about by noticing Stella's genuine feelings for Stanley is obviously a recollection of her own traumatic marriage, and that's the subtext to this following dialogue, is that she is experiencing internal conflict. She's reminded of her previously tragic marriage, and is sort of bracing herself to discuss this with Stella. And you see this partly through the stage directions. This all comes out in an uneasy rush. We can tell that there's an enormous amount of anxiety that's motivating this dialogue. I haven't asked you the things you probably thought I was going to ask, and so I'll expect you to be understanding about what I have to tell you. We're back to finding Blanche annoying here, I think, There are all sorts of things going on in this piece of dialogue that reveal a lot about her character. Firstly, I haven't asked you the things you probably thought I was going to ask. I think she's been fairly probing with her, but not really questions. It's wrong to call them questions, but with her statements and judgments about Stella's life. She has been fairly, invasive with her dialogue with Stella. So there's a misunderstanding there. There's a lack of self-awareness in that declaration. And secondly, she says, I'll expect you to be understanding about what I have to tell you. What she's obviously warming up to telling Stella is about what's happened to her. Why is she here? Why is she in such a desperate state? But she's massively misunderstanding Stella's character. Stella is understanding, and at least begins that way. She's very tolerant and understanding and shows a genuine warmth towards Blanche until Blanche irritates the life out of her. So she not only misunderstands herself, but she misunderstands her sister, and that's part of her alienation. And in many ways, she's like lots of the characters in Pinter's plays who fail to and don't want to be understood by others. They want to remain isolated and alienated from each other. And then Stella says, what, Blanche? Her face turns anxious. And this misunderstanding is developed here. Well, Stella, you're going to reproach me. She's warming up to telling her about Belle Reve, the plantation estate and what's happened to it and its doomed fate. But she thinks, there's a massive misunderstanding of Stella here. She thinks that Stella's going to chastise her for it and admonish her and tell her off. But of course, she's not, because she has herself left that way of life and everything that it represents and has adapted to a new reality. So partly what this reveals is her lack of self-awareness, her lack of ability to understand Stella, and also, I think, the way that she is clinging on to the reality that Belle Reve represents. And it's no coincidence that that's what she then goes on to talk about. I know that you're bound to reproach me, but before you do, take into consideration, you left. I stayed and struggled. You came to New Orleans and looked out for yourself. I stayed at Belle Reve and tried to hold it together. I'm not meaning this in any reproachful way, but all the burden descended on my shoulders. This is... there's so much tension between what she actually says and the way that she delivers it. She doesn't mean it in any reproachful way, but it's full of exclamation marks and italicized words that emphasize her own importance in this. And what it's, I stayed and struggled. That captures really the essence of her entire personality, that she is clinging on to the plantation itself, but also the social hierarchy and the social organization and the values that plantation embodies. She is attached to the way of living that the Old South is so comfortable with. You came to New Orleans and looked out for yourself. And what we see there is the tension between that communal identity that the Old South values is built on and the sort of rampant individualism of 20th century materialism. You came to New Orleans, adapted, and looked out for yourself. But she changed with the times, and that's what the times were requiring. I stayed at Belle Reve and tried to hold it all together. That line really captures the tragic nature of her fate. I stayed at Belle Reve, this name that means beautiful dream. It's a lovely illusion. It's not real. And tried to hold it all together. And that's the source of her internal conflict, is the attempt to keep all this together in spite of the enormous power of the changing reality in which she finds herself that's dragging it apart and crushing it. And that's really what causes her dramatic tension and her dramatic conflict. All the burden descended on my shoulders. So we see here that this is a self-appointed choice. She chooses to cling on to this reality. No one else cares. No one else in her family really cares. They've all frittered away their fortune. Stella's left. Everyone else has either died or spent all their money on, something out of a Rolling Stones song, prostitutes and alcohol, basically, is the implication. And her crisis begins here. The best I could do was make my own living, Blanche. This is the conflict between these values. Stella says, that the most useful thing I can do in this circumstance is not be a burden on the dwindling finances of the family. I have to go out and make my own living and make my own money and adapt to the new reality. And Blanche begins to shake again with intensity. This conflict here that's embodied in her physical reaction to this trauma is between the changing reality of the American 20th century and her conceptualization of the Old South through the lens of an aesthetic. She thinks it's a sort of artistic creation. And that's where the artist figure, the stock type of the kind of traumatized artist, comes into Blanche's character, is that her vision of her previous life and its values is a vision of someone artistic. She sees the Old South and its illusory reality as a sort of aesthetic construction. You know, there's a sort of similarity between her, say, and Aschenbach in Death in Venice, who views his relationship with Tadzio through the lens of an aesthetic vision. And Blanche is similar in this respect. She views her old life and her old values and her plantation and all of her family and the chivalry that's associated with it as a sort of artistic construction. Blanche says, I know, but you are the one that abandoned Belle Reve, not I. I stayed and fought for it, bled for it, almost died for it. And this is where, again, we start to see the increasingly artistic nature of Blanche's character. I stayed and fought for it, bled for it and died for it. What we've got here is hyperbole. And this, you will start to see, becomes a consistent feature of her linguistic register. Aestheticized language and hyperbole are the sort of benchmarks of her linguistic register. Because, of course, she didn't really bleed for it. She hasn't physically fought for Belle Reve. She's just stayed there and tried to keep it afloat through money and almost died for it. You know, her death is not a literal one we're talking about here. We're talking about a kind of figurative death of her character and her way of life. So she, again, structures her sacrifice through the lens of an aesthetic. She sees her clinging on to the past through the lens of aesthetic language. She sees herself as a kind of noble figure clinging on to an aestheticized ideal. And Stella understands this because she says, stop this hysterical outburst and tell me what's happened. Stop talking about this through figurative language and actually tell me in concrete, plain, real terms what the hell you're going on about. What do you mean you fought and bled? You know, this figurative language makes no sense to Stella because Blanche is being hysterical and over the top.
Maybe the fact that Williams makes like Stanley care more about Belle Reve than Stella shows how like he's commenting on how the narcissist, rigid, like masculine, dominating males of that time were kind of similar to like the super elite who didn't really want to do anything, who just wanted to live off the money. They weren't progressive like Stella is.
Oh, absolutely. That progressive is the opposite of what Blanche. You know, she 100% is conservative, and I don't mean that necessarily in a political way. I mean clinging on to the past, keeping things the way they are. She does not want change, and she does not want reality. She wants the past, even if it's in the form of an illusion, even if it's in the form of a beautiful dream. Blanche says, I knew you would, Stella. I knew you would take this attitude about it. You know, what this partly reveals is that taking an attitude is almost a sort of theatrical phrase for adopting a role. You know, I almost knew you would perform this hostility. It almost seems to undervalue the authenticity of Stella's approach, but it also shows, I think, the conflict between Stella's adaptable realism and Blanche's idealized aestheticization of reality. That Stella would see things in the practical kind of glare of reality, and Blanche would only see it as the illusory qualities of an aesthetic. And Stella says, about what? Please specify exactly what we're talking about in concrete terms. Blanche slowly says, the loss. You know, so it's not just the estate that she's talking about. She's talking about a life and a social position. And Stella has already accepted this. You know, the loss that Blanche is talking about is something that Stella has already accepted. She's already adapted and changed to a new reality. Blanche is not being concrete. But again, this is where the ambiguity comes from in this play, because William sympathizes partly with what Blanche is saying here. is it not possible for people to care about something a little bit more than, because what Stella is looking for is money, the estate, what's happened to it, who's stolen it, where's it gone? She's looking for concrete, really economic facts. And what Blanche is giving her is, hyperbole that shows her attachment to a type of moral absolutism, a kind of pure way of life that is beyond, the realities of economic exchange and the consumerism that Stella is adapted to. So there's as much as it sort of threatens parody here, there is an element of sympathy, I think, from Williams, and partly expected of us, that we sympathise with someone who, although suffering from a flawed vision, is looking at a way of valuing reality beyond the concrete terms of monetary exchange and of social progress and of industrialism. She's looking for something beyond that. She's looking for an aesthetic, and she's looking for a moral code. And that's partly what I think leads us to sympathise sometimes with Blanche. A little further down, we have this sound effect that's so prominent in the play itself, the blue piano. And this is a huge element. Williams' use of sound is a huge element of his plastic theatre. The music of the blue piano grows louder. Blanche touches her handkerchief to her forehead. Now, the dynamism of the music in this play at this moment in time, I think, represents that changing set of values that Blanche is unable to adapt to. The music in this play and the sound effects and the mise en scène often are an extended commentary on Blanche's internal state. So what you see here is that the dynamism of this music, which is fundamentally multicultural, it's fundamentally a creation of the 20th century and the admixture of races and the admixture of classes that represents the reality of America at this moment in time. This music is a constant reminder of that reality. And it's a reality that Blanche cannot adapt to. And so this juxtaposition of images here, the music of the blue piano with Blanche touching a handkerchief to her forehead. She is in this pose of, the sort of the noble female from the 19th century, juxtaposed with this music that becomes a kind of an audible equivalent of the new America that Blanche can't adapt to. And Stella, again, is in the realm of reality. But how did it go? What happened? Blanche, springing up. You're a fine one to ask me how it went. Stella just says, Blanche, you're a fine one to sit there accusing me of it. And there's a number of things going on here. Blanche's fragility and paranoia is this springing up. It takes almost nothing for her to interpret Stella's questions as accusations. This is not an accusation. She's just asking her what happened. But her kind of extreme physical reaction to this shows us that she's fragile and is waiting for an accusation, and that there's an enormous amount of self-loathing, I think, behind her behaviour. You're a fine one to ask me how it went. And she uses this language that is kind of quaint and distinctively of this set of class and social values that she's attracted to. You're a fine one, you're a fine one. And again, it shows us through vocabulary her associations with the past. She's using the language of the Southern Belle here. And she's using that language to try and express her internal conflict about the fact that identity for her is dying out. She cannot be that person anymore. She cannot be the noble Southern Belle. The reality of America is an existential threat to that identity. There is no place for it anymore. And that she's insistently using that vocabulary at the moment where her fear about her own failure to keep that reality is strongest. And of course, she is not being accused of anything here. This is a very plain question. How did it go? What happened?
It's like the opposite of like in Daisy Miller.
What specifically?
When Daisy was in Europe, like she was completely out of place in like an opposite way because she was like progressive and from this past which like class didn't really matter.
Yeah, partly. I mean, the comparison between those two characters shows you that the ideological flexibility of some of these values. They're used when it suits people in power. Usually, that Daisy Miller can be seen as progressive and yet a kind of slightly sort of pretentious rich girl at the same time as Blanche can be seen as something similar, in spite of the fact that they represent different sides of the coin in terms of America's social values and economic realities. So there's a kind of flexibility there.
Blanche is like the grandmother in the short story we read last year.
The Rim, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
I forgot the name of it.
in Daisy Mill.
No.
No, in the
Not Asia.
yeah, the one about the man that gets killed. The
Why can't I remember?
Oh,
This
the
is
one
bothering
with
me.
the
Chrysanthemums.
No. No.
Oh,
Not the chrysanthemums.
The alpenstock.
It is. Why can't I remember? This is the first time this has happened. I actually can't remember the name of this writer.
They're on a road trip. Yeah.
Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
The name of the story is.
Gabriel.
Oh,
Marquez.
the Misfit. No.
Is that story? Why can't I remember the name of this story?
But the
Also,
story
what
has
was
a
it
different
called?
name.
A blood drop from the ceiling.
Oh no.
Why the hell can't this is the most famous? This is the most famous story. Flannery O'Connor.
With the old South movie.
Yeah. Ah, it's gone.
Road trip.
No.
Road trip story.
Aparte from I remember something with a
You
No, this doesn't was heavy. I remember there was a short story actually with a
Are you teaching it now? That's part of it.
No, it's Guilherme has it.
Yeah,
Earlier. I think she's changed that bit of the course. I'll Google it and find out. So, no, it's not that. So, let's take a look at. We'll see if we can get up to the point where Stanley arrives, and then I'll make a separate video for that. This is a really important example of foreshadowing what we're about to look at here. This is foreshadowing the Mexican flower seller that we encountered later on in the story.
The Mexican flower seller.
No, flowers here are not that. This is one time where that theory is wrong. The flower seller here is sending. You're supposed to buy flowers at this moment in time. No, it's not a pimp. The Mexican flower seller is a lady who's selling flowers as part of a kind of folk ritual to commemorate the dead. So, and the key thing here is that Blanche has a kind of hostile reaction to her later on in the play, and it precipitates this dramatic moment of, no, it's not anything to do with that. It's the complete reverse. It's to do with death. But the key thing about this is that it prefigures her dramatic kind of hostile reaction to what that represents. The hostile reaction to mortality that you see in the play when the flower seller appears is prefigured in this huge monologue that Blanche undergoes here. I mean, she opens it with I took the blows in my face and my body. Again, this is not true. This is not true unless we're talking about it from a Levantinian perspective of, the seeing the sexuality that she undergoes in response to the trauma of her life as being some kind of sexual punishment for the faults of her family and of her estate and its way of life. But she, this is a sort of hysterical, gothic kind of monologue here. All of those deaths, she's now talking about her family. The long parade to the graveyard, father, mother, Margaret, that dreadful way, so big with it couldn't be put in a coffin. We've got here, I think, a suggestion of someone that's pregnant that's died, and they couldn't fit their body in a coffin, but had to be burned like rubbish. And that particular simile, again, shows us the nightmarish fears that Blanche, approaches the decline of her family's economic well-being with. We've got this through the lens of an aesthetic, and we see that earlier on in the play where she has the Poe illusion. She borrows what she knows from literature. Remember, she's an English teacher, Blanche, an irritating one for sure. She's an English teacher and uses her understanding of literature to view reality. So part of what she's doing here is that this is a kind of Edgar Allan Poe vision of the Southern decline.
Is that what you do? Use your knowledge of literature to view reality?
No, I like to think that I can switch it on and off at complete, willful moments whenever I want to.
I think then it's hard to
So that's it. Thank God for that. But this is an interesting kind of cross between the two here, because Flannery O'Connor is seen as a kind of probably the canonical writer of what's called the Southern Gothic. Her and William Faulkner, and Williams is influenced by those writers and has a real interest in them. So the fact that you kind of picked up a kind of overlap between the two is not a coincidence. He repeatedly comes back to the Southern Belle as a kind of stock character, and that's a key feature of Flannery O'Connor's writings, and the way that Southern reality struggles to adapt to the kind of life current of America. And that's what makes it Gothic, is that it's this kind of backwards eddy that hasn't connected to the life source of America, which is effectively capital, money and economic industrialization, and that it's its own little separate sort of social ecosystem that is decaying because it's deprived of its life force, which is effectively slavery. It's collapsing back on itself. And that's where I think this Gothic imagery comes from. This body that's burned like rubbish. And funerals are pretty compared to deaths. Funerals are quiet, but deaths, not always. Sometimes their breathing is hoarse, and sometimes it rattles, and sometimes they even cry to you, "Don't let me go." Even the old sometimes say, "Don't let me go," as if you were able to stop them. But funerals are quiet with pretty flowers, and there's the vocabulary trigger for that example of foreshadowing. Funerals are the deceptive kind of aestheticized version of mortality. And that's what she then later identifies in this seller, this Mexican flower seller, who is selling flowers because of a folk tradition to commemorate the dead. So the logical connection for her, seeing this as a token of mortality, is there. She sees these flowers as the sign of mortality and of death and of degradation. And oh, what gorgeous boxes they packed them away in, unless you were there at the bed when they cried out, "Hold me," you'd never suspect there was a struggle for breath and bleeding. You didn't dream, but I saw, and now you sit there telling me with your eyes that I let the place go. And again, you've got her hysteria here, and her hysteria is being registered through figurative language, that she's telling her with her eyes, she's personifying Stella's eyes, and that there is a suggestion here, I think, of the relationship between madness and artistry, that her hysterical vision of reality, the way that Williams is communicating to us is through his medium, the medium of poetry. That poetry is madness here. That the way that she's seeing reality is through the lens of figurative language, and that's what's telling us about perhaps the connection between artistry and madness, and partly to do with then Blanche's tragic fate is the one of the artist that is unable to adapt to the cold light of day, so to speak, the plain reality in its unadorned terms. How in the hell do you think all that sickness and dying was paid for? Death is expensive. So there's a kind of, I think, a metaphorical understanding there. The cost of this death is obviously the estate itself. They've had to use the estate to pay for everyone's mortality. And that shows us that collapsing inwards that is so associated with the Southern Gothic. That sense of an America that is deprived of its life source. This plantation dies because slavery is no longer allowed. So its economic life stream is cut off, and then it dies, it decays, and that's where the Gothic quality comes from. And that death is expensive shows us that logic, but it's also expensive in terms of what it's cost Blanche. It's cost Blanche her sanity, effectively. Miss Stella, an old cousin Jessie's right after Margaret's, hers. Why, the Grim Reaper has put up his tent on our doorstep. Again, personification. She's using figurative language to make sense of the decaying of her social norms and the decaying of the Old South and its values. Belle Rev was his headquarters, and there's a huge irony there, a huge irony in that juxtaposition of the name of that plantation. The Beautiful Dream was the headquarters of the Grim Reaper. This shows us the illusory nature of the way that she views life and reality at this moment in time. Honey, that's how it slipped through my fingers. But notice again, what we don't have is, say that Stella is her accountant. He's not going to be very satisfied with what he just heard, is he? He's gone to see a financial advisor, and this is well. How did the finances of the estate cause its decay? We've got no answer still. We've got Blanche's hysterical figurative language telling us about the fact that what is being decayed means more to her than the money. You know, the loss of what it represents is what's important to her here. Honey, that's how it slipped through my fingers. Which of them left us a fortune? Which of them left a cent of insurance even? Only poor Jessie. 100 to pay for her coffin. That was all, Stella. And I with my pitiful salary at the school. Yes, accuse me. Sit there and stare at me thinking I let the place go. I let the place go. Where were you? In bed with your Polak. So here, we've got this full kind of sense of degeneration here. That she is unable to deal with this new reality, and that actually where Stella is engaging in carnal desire with someone that represents the new America. You know, Stella is quite literally wedding herself physically to the new reality, while Blanche is desperately trying to cling on to its outmoded values. But this is incredibly hypocritical. Incredibly hypocritical, because what actually is Stella doing at this moment in time? Well, she's sleeping around. You know, her vision of what she does to kind of compensate for Belle Rev and its loss of income.
You mean Blanche is sleeping?
Yeah, sorry, Blanche is sleeping around with soldiers. You know, she's not actually doing anything that's getting money for the estate. She's not doing anything practical that would likely keep it afloat. She's doing something in her mind. She's trying to escape reality. She's sleeping with soldiers. She's desperately trying to conjure up some intimacy that seems to be beyond possibility for her at this moment in time. So there's an enormous hypocrisy in what she accuses Stella of here. You know, she accuses her of basically sleeping with the new reality, sleeping with the new America, and betraying their past. But so is she, at the same time as she's deluding herself that what she's doing is actually clinging on to that past and those values. So while Stella is in bed with a Polish immigrant, Blanche is sleeping with all the infantry in the military as well. So she is not doing anything to cling on to that outmoded sense of social value. Now, we will stop there.
Don't touch that, honey.